Well, I've got 6:30, so we'll go ahead and open up with prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also
with you.
with you.
Pray. Lord, as you speak the truth of your love to us and remind us of the blessing, life, and love, and of your grace in all things, so too may we remember that it speaks to us in the midst of our places of hurt and pain. Grant that we may find in those places not opportunities to run away from you, but rather to stand firm and to hold fast to your grace and truth, which heals all and binds us all together, even in the midst of things that we cannot control and understand. Grant your grace upon our conversation and upon those who are listening through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so welcome everyone, and welcome to all of you out in YouTube land who will be tuning into this later. Delighted to have you. I actually had 6 people this week, not of this group, who are on Zoom right now, who have said to me they watch it on YouTube and have been enjoying it. So I am glad that y'all are enjoying this and delighted that you are here again. So we got a lot to cover, so we'll get right to it so we can honor our time of 1 hour. I want to start in your book. We're kind of finish up a couple of little comments on the blessed chapter, and then we'll move into one that a couple of you have already told me it was a struggle for you to read, and obviously so, the broken one. On page 75 in your book is a statement that he makes kind of the middle of the page, paragraph that starts right there in the middle. And it says, well, if the blessing speaks the truth and the curse speaks lies about who you and I are, we are faced with the very concrete question, how to hear and claim the blessing. We talked about this a little bit last week, but before we get into the broken chapter, I want to remind you of that statement that he says. Blessing speaks the truth about who we are. I don't think we need conversation because we got into that last week, but it speaks to God's love for us. It speaks to we are created to be creatures who are full of life, light, and grace. We are not created to be people who are weighed by the merits of what we do. We are not created as people who are under the wrath of an angry God, despite what some of us may have heard in other places and in other times. We are created to be loved by God. That is what blessing does. And just a reminder, benediction, that word that blessing comes from, means to speak well. And I hope you remember the image from last week too, where I said blessing, when we say the blessing at the end of the church, of the end of the liturgy every week, whether it's Eucharist, morning prayer, or even Compline, there's a blessing at the end of that service. It is a reminder to us that that truth goes with us, and that that truth is meant to be shared with other people, that we are meant to be a blessing to one another. I stress that because the context needs to be held as we go into this next chapter, which is on brokenness. He starts that chapter by saying, the top of page 86, he talks about his relationship with his friend that this book is a dialogue with. And he says, we became increasingly open to each other about our suffering and pain. In fact, the sharing of our deep struggles became a sign of our friendship. I'm kind of warm us up with a fairly obvious question, but it might spur us on to a little deeper conversation later. When you think of your friends, is it true of your friends that one of the traits of our friendships is that these are people that we can share hard experiences with? Is that true or false?
It rang very true for me. I have 2 friends. There were 4 of us. One has died. when the husband of one died and she said, I need you. The other two, we got on the airplane and we went to Arizona. We have that kind of friendship that has lasted since college.
Thank you. Anyone else, true or false?
Well, it's been true for me. It seems like the ones I can be open and really share with are the ones that I've grown up with.
Mm-hmm.
That they know where I've come from, and likewise.
Yeah. I've shared a lot of stuff with them. I joke with people who've known me for a long time. Y'all know a lot of dirt on me too, and you still like me for some reason. People I grew up in school with are like, "You're a priest now, really? No, we still love you anyway." But it's like, we didn't see that one coming. True or false? Anyone else?
That's true for me. Yeah,
You
I'm here.
Okay, you froze up there. Try again. Let's see if we can hear you this time. Let me move on to something else unless somebody else wants to speak up on that front. A passage that I really relate to, that he says, and I relate to it both as a person and as a priest, what I do, vocation. Bottom of page 87. I am deeply convinced that each human being suffers in a way no other human being suffers. No doubt we can make comparisons. We can talk about more or less suffering, but in the final analysis, your pain and my pain are so deeply personal that comparing them can bring scarcely any consolation or comfort. What's been your experience of that? Do you agree with that statement? And if you do, what's been your experience of sharing that with someone? And if not, what's been your experience of, what does it mean? Let me kind of back up with a more basic question. What does it mean to share pain with one another? What does that mean?
I'm reminded of something that happened a little more than a year ago. I had actually, the day that I started at St. Stephen's, my cat, Eddie, was very sick and had to be taken to the emergency clinic. And then for the next 3 months, he was very ill, had to be fed 4 times a day through a tube in his neck. And it was an exercise in great patience and love and being able to finally let him go. And I remember going into church the next day and being able to go up to Ronnie, who had been very, very supportive of me. She was in the kitchen and she was surrounded by all these other people. And I just had tears going down my face, and she knew pretty much what had happened. And even though she was busy, she gave me the time to say, let her know, give me a hug. And even though none of the other ladies who were preparing food for a big event that we were having that time, I definitely felt that there was this sort of wall of comfort coming around me that was very sympathetic, and it validated that pain. And the first time that I'd ever had an animal die on me very suddenly, it was a dog that I'd had. I loved this dog very, very much, and she died very suddenly. And I had never had a big experience of death in my life. And sharing that pain with my mother, she would tell me all these other stories about, oh, well, I used to have this dog and it died this time, and my friend had this dog and it died that time. And it was a completely different experience, where when you share that pain, when it is compared, comparing pain can scarcely bring any consolation or comfort. That is exactly the case, because it made me feel like, well, get over it. Your pain is not important. It is, everybody goes through this. And it didn't validate it at all. It didn't recognize that pain was real.
Somebody might said something to you like, well, it's just a cat or it's just a dog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a conversation today, an email conversation with a woman who has lost 2 of her 4 dogs in the last 2 weeks. And she said, well, it's just something to the effect of, well, it's just dogs. Like other people have it so much worse. And I actually used this and threw it back at her and said, you are entitled to feel just as rotten as you feel about this. And I think the only thing you can really do is be there. All you can do is be there. I've never been through, and I have a friend whose husband is dying. I've never been through that. And I'll never go through that. And that, what do I know? But I can be there for her, and I can listen to her, and I can maybe reflect back. But that's all you can do. I mean, maybe that's as close as we get.
Still an incredibly wonderful gift to offer the presence. Yeah, I like it, and I want other people to join in on this too. Having my son can have a meltdown over something. I'm sitting there going, "What? Why are you upset about this? I dropped my army man out of the backyard, and I can't find it." And that's a 5-minute nuclear meltdown of proportions beyond anything imaginable. And as the adult, quote unquote, it's so easy for me to say, well, it's just an argument.
Hey, honey.
Get over it. But for him, and this is one of the things I've learned as a parent, while as a parent, you have to sort of lead them away from that moment. You can only do that by being with them in that moment of being upset. And if you dismiss it, then that tells them emotionally, well, somebody else experiences distress. Well, you just get over it, just move on. And that's not how, as human beings, we are equipped to handle those kind of things. So, anyone else? Anybody else care to share?
Well, this is Joe. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Joe. We've seen you come on and off. I'm glad you're on. We can hear you.
Okay. I was just going to sort of echo what you all have already said, but the way he writes about it being, unique to the person, and it's like a part of them. I just agree that the best thing is your presence. And for me, both as a person who's been in a situation with, like somebody else had described, someone wanting to be helpful, and people say, I don't know what to say sometimes. Well, then that would be the best thing, not just be with them. I think that's the way you honor the person, and you honor whatever it is they're feeling.
Yeah.
And I would hope that, that's something that some of us never really learn, or we learn it later in life. So I would hope that all of us, whenever we're around children, like you're saying, as a parent or a teacher or just a friend, that, we could in some way model that to them, so that they maybe have a chance to start learning that earlier in life, that just their presence, and that they don't have to try to make it better, because in fact we can't really make it better for them. So that's what I wanted to say.
No, very good.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
The last question that I heard, because I was moving around, was about having a group of people that, you could share your pain with. And I didn't find that until later, in my life. But when I did, it's very healing. And I was blessed to find a group that we all have been through similar things. And it changed my life, basically. But it also helped me to really find God. I think when there's that much power behind you, affirming who you are. It's not just the people that I met, but there was a power behind that helped me heal a great deal. And so today, because of that, you know, I can help others too. And so that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
No, thank you. And just back to what we said at the beginning, you know, it was sharing a blessing to others through the presence of being with them in their pain and going through the pain yourself, that you can share that with. Several of you have made the comment about sometimes you don't know what to say. All you can do is be there. And that's it. Stories I wanted to tell real quick. One's about me and one's about a friend. The friend I was on the phone with earlier today, a friend of mine whose wife had suffered a very debilitating illness for the last several years, and she died not too long ago. And he told me earlier today, he said that without going into too many details, that he feels like people are going to tell him, well, how you feeling, and all of this stuff. And he says, I feel guilty telling them I'm not really all that sad at this point, because my experience of grief has been, I've been grieving her for years and watching her go downhill. Does that make me a bad person to do that? I said, absolutely not, because your experience of losing her was a very unique experience. You literally lost her a piece at a time over many, many years. And kind of along, Connie, what you were saying, when my father died 20 years ago, very suddenly, one of my very, very good friends, who's also a priest now, just sat with me most of the night, just sat with me. We may have said a few words to each other here and there, but just sat. And I'm trying to figure out what is this that just happened and how my life has just changed. Losing my dad when I was in my early 20s, that's what she offered to me. It was the best gift I could get, just to be there with somebody. And so everybody carries something a little different. And that's such an important thing to remember then as we kind of start diving into more of the explicit theology of this, because again, as we tie this into the Eucharist, the formula of taken and blessed and now broken, when Jesus breaks the bread, and in the Eucharistic prayer and in the stories in Scripture of the Last Supper, this is my body, which is given for you. And I remember a liturgics professor in seminary said, keep in mind that the you in that, and in some of the very ancient rites, Latin and Syriac and some of the other languages of the early ancient church, the you in a couple of those instances was often flip-flopping between a singular and a plural. We often assume it to be a plural. What do you hear when you hear the word say, this is my body given and broken for you, singular? Does that make any difference if you were to hear those words said in that way? Broken for you, Jim. Broken for you, Elizabeth. Broken for you, Betsy. And so on and so on and so forth. Does that make any difference to hear those words said in the singular?
That's interesting to me, because of course that's the way I had always heard it and learned it.
You learned it in the singular?
Singular. So I hadn't even thought of it the other way.
Yeah. See, I
guess it's what you grew up with.
That's it. I grew up both in the Church of Christ, and then when I came into the Episcopal Church, it was always said, well, it's a plural thing. It's for the group of us, which is an important thing, because it's a reminder that Jesus died for all, and salvation is intimately tied into the community, and it's not just about my salvation or when I was saved, but yet it's also important for me, especially, to hear that message said to me directly from time to time. Anybody else have that experience? Anybody else raised with like Mary was, with it being a singular? Victoria? I see a couple of you shaking your head, though. Anybody want to elaborate on that?
Well, I have always thought of it as me, but in the congregation, I'm assuming that everyone in the congregation is feeling the same thing. So it's for me and for many.
Mm-hmm.
I heard it as given for each one of you,
Mm-hmm.
you and you and you, so that it's personal, but it's also collective.
Yeah. Both are necessary.
Yeah,
Anybody?
for me, it kind of, it's to imagine it is just for me. It's like, no, it's for all of us. I have a really hard time with, occasionally I'll hear music on the radio or something, and it might be the Christian rock channel, and it's like, Jesus died for me. I'm like, no, for everybody. And so it's, I don't know, it's a little bit uncomfortable to think of it as being, for me, personal, because I just don't think that way. It feels really selfish to say, oh, he died for me, for Elizabeth, because that feels like it excludes Victoria, it excludes Tom and Deborah, and that's not what I believe.
Well, it's kind of the uniqueness of the word and the way it can be interpreted. Like Victoria said, both as personal and collective, individual and collective. I guess I've always thought of it directed at me when it's said, but like Elizabeth said, it's for everybody, or James, it's for everybody that's there as well.
I know, well, I wasn't in on this last week, but the week before, I think, was when there was just the discussion about the, like being taken or chosen.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember now all of how he explained that, but I mean, now, and when he was talking about that, what I'm thinking, somebody else remind me, but I think he was saying, it's like in the context of what he was discussing there anyway, this just came to my mind, yes, it is you as an individual, not meaning it excludes anyone else, but remind me what his thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I'm going to paraphrase him too, but you're right. What he essentially said, my paraphrase version of it was, the love of being chosen or taken, or Mary, remind me of the word that you used when we talked about that chapter. What was the word?
Yeah, it was marked.
Marked. Yes, thank you. As in the mark of baptism.
As in marked as belonging.
Christ's own forever. But to paraphrase that, it was, whatever that word is, it was explicitly for you, but not exclusive to you.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you an example of where I noticed that very profoundly was when James Henry was baptized. The priest who did the baptism, who's a good friend of mine, spoke the words in the Eucharistic prayer. And when she was distributing communion, she came around and looked at me, the body of Christ given for you, Bailey. Oh. And she told me afterwards, outside of the context of the liturgy, said, broken for you, who's a dad to James Henry, who is the responsibility of being one of the leaders in the family, of someone who has the charge of raising him up in the life of the church. Remember these words, the body of Christ given for and to you. And I've never forgotten that. And that's what really reminded me, that baptism, it wasn't just, this pretty little thing that we do with kids. It was the charge, as we say in the baptismal covenant, the charge is made to the parents and godparents and all who raise up that child. You are being chosen as their parents for that special purpose. The body of Christ, thus given to you to help you in your journey in what God has chosen you to do as the father of this child. So, any other reactions to that?
Well, this is kind of, I guess, what you just said. But if you think, in my mind, if I think of you as the general mankind, it makes it a little more generic, and gives me kind of an out if I don't want to accept it. Whereas if I think of it as a personal me, then I've got a responsibility to accept it and to act on it. So it creates a little bit of a responsibility and burden, but also opportunity. If you think of it as a personal or singular.
Yeah. And Elizabeth, I wholeheartedly agree with you. It makes me uncomfortable. And part of it too is from some of the theology that's out there that is just all about, me and Jesus, and it's all about me and Jesus. But when my friend looked at me in that baptism and said those words to me, it made me realize that I can't be a spectator in this, that God has chosen me and broken himself for me in order to be much more than a spectator. And I think that's the discomforting part of it. Kind of moving back into the book a little bit, I just thought that was a good little tangent to kind of help us, again, remind ourselves of the Eucharistic context of this book. But, of course, we know because of the work we do as a church, I know those of us who work regularly in the office before COVID-19 saw people coming in off the streets needing help. Those of you who've been to Haiti have seen hunger, poverty beyond anything we could imagine. And if you've traveled anywhere, you've seen people suffering physically, mentally, economically. So, and he makes that very clear in this book, but he also makes the point of saying, this is on page 89, in the Western world, the suffering that seems to be the most painful is that of feeling rejected, ignored, despised, and left alone. In my own community, the large community with many severely handicapped men and women, the greatest source of suffering is not the handicap itself, but the accompanying feelings of being useless, worthless, unappreciated, and unloved. I'll give you an example of this in some conversation I had with somebody not long ago at St. Stephen's, who told me flat out that they felt because of their age, they were no longer useful. And it was weighing on them heavily. Physically able to do what they once did. And it wasn't the physical ailment that was bothering them. So I can live with the physical ailment. It's just I'm not useful anymore. Without going again into too much personal detail that want you to again share it over this venue, but where do your own feelings of brokenness lie? Is it lie more in physical or emotional, or physical or mental? Does it lie more in economic? Does it lie more in just a sense of anxiety or depression, or a sense of being lonely? Or even more generic terms than that, if you're not comfortable going into that. But where does brokenness lie for you? Or for people if you don't want to answer for yourself.
In terms of one of my daughters who had a stroke 8 years ago, she is no longer able to do much. And while she doesn't complain, and she does have a husband who takes good care of her, she's an MD, and she can no longer practice or be of any use to those who need her skills. And I'm sure that must weigh on her.
Thank you, Judith. Anyone else?
I'm sure I'm not the only one who grew up in a family, has a family where there's sort of a legacy of secrets in the family. And that can certainly isolate a person. I mean, because there are certain things that you just learn that when you're around other people and you're talking about certain things. Sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry. I think I needed to shed a few tears. And I'm not talking me, specifically me, but in my family. Like, I mean, again, there's that legacy, and seeing how that affects a person's life as they, it might affect one member of the family one way, depending on which side of the secret you were on. If you knew that, or you grew up not knowing it while somebody else in the family knew it. It's, well, again, the ways a person, and this is different for everybody too, the ways you might deal with it as a child in terms of coping, and then as you get older, because sometimes I don't need to go on and on about this, but I'm going to say one more thing. You might not know about these secrets when you're young, and then you find out about them later, and it's just, anyway, that whole issue of secrets in families over generations, that's what I was thinking about, and that's enough said about that.
Yeah. No, and I mean, you've said a lot without saying too much specific. I think all of us can relate. Some of us grew up in families where everybody just speaks their mind. Some of us more reserved, but then I think all of us probably have found out some things that were like, "Ooh, this is a part of our past. Our past is checkered. Our present is checkered because of the past." And yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh.
Connie, yes, we can hear you.
I just wanted to reiterate something that Joe just said. I agree with the family dynamics growing up can cause a lot of things, later as you start to grow up. It can cause some problems with knowing how to relate to life and making good choices, and there are scars, and for me, on my journey, it took me a little while getting through all of that. I don't know if you can still hear me.
We can.
And the brokenness, part of it, it's really, I mean, I'm not saying I would want to go through it again or would pick that as a soul to go through again, but that's where my closeness to God came from. I don't think I would have ever found the relationship I have today with God if I hadn't walked through that and had a lot of support, loving people, and none of it was my doing. It was all God, and coming to realize that has made me a stronger person, and I feel grateful today to have experienced that. And anyway, thanks for letting me share that.
There's an important statement I want. It's not in response to Connie or anybody. It's just something that just strikes me as, especially about where we're going to go in the conversation next, is something that I say to people and something I have to be reminded of is God does not cause brokenness in our life to make us stronger, but rather brokenness is a part of our life. You can debate the philosophy and all the endless rabbit holes. Where did all of that come from? The problem of evil question. The reality is that it's there, and God doesn't cause it to make us lean on God anymore, but rather it is there. And it's such difference in how we approach it versus when we just say, well, God caused this to us, so there must be a plan or one of those things. And I believe God has a plan, but just to walk up to somebody, as I remember somebody in the receiving line at my dad's funeral who just was going on and on and on, that God must have a plan for this. And I just wanted to say, was what I wanted to do in response to that. There is a prophetic statement, I think, for our current situation on page 92, and he speaks about AIDS patients, which I have a very minimal experience working with those with AIDS. I knew a few people in Mobile who had it, and I knew a few people who were active in the ministry, and that was about my involvement. But he writes this comment, and just tell me if you don't hear a little bit of our world today in this comment. Seeing AIDS patients die and seeing the spontaneous generosity with which their friends form community to support them with affection and material and spiritual help, I often wonder if this horrendous illness is not a clear summons to conversion directed to a world doomed by competition, rivalry, and ever-increasing isolation. Take out AIDS and put in COVID-19, maybe, without being dismissive of those obviously going through AIDS, an awful disease in of itself. That statement packs a punch. It's sort of the statement that ties the reality of our brokenness versus then, okay, what do we do with this brokenness? And it's the big question we're all struggling with as human beings, and then more specifically as well as the church. How do we form community in the midst of challenging circumstances? And I think what he's calling us to be reminded of is that in the midst of these things, which again, it's not God punishing us for, fill in the blank, whatever group it is that's sinful and causing all the problems in the world, but rather in the midst of this thing that is with us, wherever it came from, that it is, we don't like to use as Episcopalians, but a summons to conversion, or a summons to be reminded of what truly matters and who we truly are. Always helped me to hear conversion said by an Anglican priest, as conversion is just stepping back and facing the direction which God is and who we truly are. That's what conversion is. It's not the hyper sinful packed language that it's often used in some circles. It does speak of our brokenness and our sinfulness, but it's rather a redirection to where we're supposed to be from. So he goes on that page, says, okay, like he does in in these previous chapters, he gives a couple of ways to how do we respond to this. I want I'm really interested to hear y'all's opinion on this. Bottom of page 92. The first response to brokenness then is to face it squarely and befriend it. I'm just gonna let that one sit for a minute. Anybody want to jump on that one?
That is one of the hardest things to attempt to do, where you are confronted with something that is very painful and everything in you says, no, I don't want this. I don't want to feel this. I don't want to experience this. But you know that it's coming, whatever it is, and being able to say, okay, I know this is going to be painful. I don't like it, but I accept it. And it's a way of experiencing something without maybe identifying it as pain. I don't know how else to sort of describe that. And it can be, physical pain. I think I once hurt myself when as a little kid, thinking, well, don't think of it as pain, just think of it as like a really strong sensation, but don't call it pain. It was and it did lessen it, the whatever the scrape was or something. Being able to face brokenness and befriend it is, I think, the equivalent of sort of turning the other cheek in the full meaning of what that scripture reference says. If the law says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, you must turn the other cheek. To that extent, where it's, you have to do the thing that is opposite of what you think you can do or what you should do.
I mean, he says suffering of any kind, physical, mental, emotional, is almost always experienced as an unwelcome intrusion into our lives. So, which naturally is, bar the door, we don't want to deal with this. And like Elizabeth said, he's saying, no, let's do the opposite of that. Who else? Other reactions to that statement? We befriend it.
I think at some point, you can struggle with it for a while, you can push it away, you can deny it, whatever you want to do with it, but until you, like he says, until you face it straight on, you're not going anywhere. You're stuck. At least that's what I find.
Yeah.
Right.
I could fight with it for a long time, but when the fight's gone, what are you going to do? I mean, okay, let's pick up the pieces and, I mean, it sounds very trite probably, but let's pick up the pieces and go on and figure out where we go from here. And it's those times in my life where, because I'm really vulnerable. I mean, that my relationship with God is strengthened through that, because everything around me is kind of falling apart. So I find comfort in that.
Mm-hmm.
Finally sort of give up and face it.
I think I come down where Betsy does in the end, but I have a little bit of, I'm not sure about the befriend part, but that could be because, it's just not a concept I'm comfortable with. I think you have to learn to share time and space with it and not confront it in an adversarial way, but be with it in a way that allows you to assimilate, may not be the right word, but come to terms with it so that you can come down in that place where Betsy ended up.
It's almost like sitting with a friend you don't know what to say to. Or somebody that's had a loss, and you just kind of have to sit with it.
I have one friend, I have absolutely nothing in common with this woman. We've been friends for a million years. And every time we get together, we have a wonderful time, and we always end by saying, why are we friends? We have absolutely nothing in common. And it's sort of, it's that kind of, you just have to make that space and things happen.
Yeah, he echoes what y'all are saying. He's tells the story about where he goes in and visits his friend when realizes his marriage had come to an end. And several people have said this, including me in varying ways. Page 95, he says, when I realized that I knew that the only thing I could do was to be with you, stay with you and somehow encourage you not to run away from your pain, but to trust that you had the strength to stand in it. Now, many years later, you can say that indeed you could stand in your pain and grow strong through it. And then, skip down a couple of lines, he says, but I cannot do that on my own. I need someone to keep me standing in it, to assure me that there is peace beyond the anguish, life beyond death, and love beyond fear. In my role as priest, but I think I've experienced this in non-priestly functions. Sometimes just being present with someone who's in pain, just sitting with it, with my own or with someone else's, and having someone sit behind the person who's sitting with the person in pain. You may not know what to say, you may not know what to do, but you are pointing to something. You're pointing to something that's beyond the moment that you're in. You're embracing it, and you're standing. Embracing may not be the right word. You're standing in it, and you're holding in it, but you're pointing to something beyond it just by being present. Again, I think I said this first week, but Jesus in his ministry, and all the miracles and all the great teaching, most of his time spent just being present, spent being present with his disciples, present with the sinners, being present with people who were, say, they're just run-of-the-mill people, or they're run-of-the-mill people because, life was dumping on them in some way, shape, or form. And Jesus didn't just wave his hand and just magically make all of that disappear. He did in certain instances, obviously, with the miracle stories. But people who felt lonely, isolated, and despair, it wasn't a magic trick. It was presence of God. Again, the Eucharistic presence is a reminder to us that being in the presence of God, being in the presence of each other, is sometimes the only thing, but the right thing to do in the midst of our brokenness. Bottom of page 95, he says, the deep truth is that our human suffering need not be an obstacle to the joy and peace we so desire, but can become instead a means to it. Ooh. That's some prophetic vision there, or a bunch of malarkey, depending on your perspective. I tend to adopt the former perspective. That's out of experience, and that's out of faith, too. But again, if you believe that God causes things in order to teach us something, in the long term, you're probably not going to find joy and desire out of that. Because then, like, why are you doing this? But in the midst of these things happen, and salvation in it is Jesus and Spirit, and the presence that we have in simply loving each other and being present with each other, then maybe we can find that joy.
Could we read one more sentence?
Yes, read one more.
Where it says, the great secret of the spiritual life, the life of the beloved sons and daughters of God, is that everything we live, be it gladness or sadness, joy or pain, health or illness, can all be part of the journey toward the full realization of our humanity. And I think living in, I think there's a lot in our culture at like this point in time, but I'm sure many of us at certain times in our lives, we've kind of talked about this some already, but there's sort of a thing of avoiding pain, avoiding discomfort or whatever, as if we can do that, and believing that maybe if you do this, then this won't happen, or instead of realizing that it's all part of the same ball of wax, and that without one you wouldn't have the other, without the pain or the sadness or whatever, you wouldn't have a realization and an understanding of the opposite of that. And I mean, because some things I've read before about the suffering and all that, I would think, I don't know. But when I look at it, I mean, I know that it's part of life. I don't have any difficulty like accepting that, claiming that. But in terms, I mean, you know, thinking about the more you can embrace, as he says there, all of these different things, whether it's positive, negative, whatever, we'll have more realization, a full realization of our humanity. I think that's pretty powerful to even, I'm sure that I've heard that many times in my life, but I think, you know, how we hear things differently at different times in our lives because of where we are.
Good, thank you.
You know, and I think this one more thing about him, because, you know, he, you know, part of the power of the things he wrote, and again, remembering that the things we read that he wrote, you know, a lot of it sounds pretty contemporary. And like, well, sure, yeah, you hear other people saying that. I mean, this was written, even this book was written, I don't know, 92, which that's been a while. And then like his book, The Wounded Healer, that was written in the 70s. I mean, so he just, I think clearly, and many people feel this way about him, he had this way of writing so simply and just writing what, you know, people felt. And sometimes people didn't expect to hear that from a priest. But it was, you know, his willingness to share, you know, and be so honest about, you know, about what he had experienced. And not that people who haven't suffered all these various things shouldn't write about it, but I do think it makes a difference if someone has that ability to honestly, simply express it. So.
Good, thank you. And adding that sentence did enhance everything. Thank you for sharing that, Joe. Let me, couple of minutes left here, and this will kind of be our cliffhanger for next time, because a couple of things I want to finish in this chapter, but we won't have time. The second response, page 96, there in the middle, the second response to our brokenness is to put it under the blessing. Might seem obvious on the surface, but again, another little axiom that I was taught, actually in the Church of Christ, I was taught this, reaffirmed in the Episcopal Church. When God saves us, God doesn't save the parts that we like or that God likes. God saves all of us. And as I said earlier, if brokenness is a part of our life, God saves that as well. And so thus the truth of God's love for us, who we are as the beloved, to fit the theme of the book, is that joy and despair, success and failure, what we do well, but what is completely fractured and shattered in our lives, all falls under that blessing. We are not divided creatures. We are good and for the bad, what we see and what we don't see. And he goes on in that same paragraph to say our brokenness is often so frightening to face because we live it under the curse. Living our brokenness under the curse means that we experience our pain as a confirmation of our negative feelings about ourselves. Oh, I deserve this. Oh, I made mistakes. Oh, you know, the feelings of guilt that we heap on ourselves, certainly the feelings that other people heap on us, comments that may be not said in malice, but things go back to Elizabeth's story about losing your cat and your dog. Yeah, and Victoria, you said this too. Oh, it's just a dog. Oh, it's just a cat. You know, it's like, well, I feel bad now that I'm mourning a cat or a dog. Never mind that that was a part of my family, but you just made me feel bad doing, you know, when you said that to me. And he goes on to say there's always something in us searching for an explanation of what takes place in our lives. And if we have already yielded to the temptation of self-rejection, then every form of misfortune only deepens. So to me, it gives a little bit of little bit of explanation about befriending brokenness. Because otherwise, brokenness just reminds us of that other message that's telling us we're not worth it. Why does God even bother with us? Why do we even bother? Those things that take us into those feelings of anxiety and depression, rejection, and all those other things that go with it. And there's so much more to go with that, but we have hit our time. And so I want to stop there. So a couple of administrative things before we wrap up. Next Thursday is off from this because it's Ascension Day. We will actually have a service that will be taking the place of this class next week at 7 instead of 6:30. The conclusion of this class will meet in 2 weeks. We'll see how far we get. Y'all want to go one more week? We need to go one more week. I'm fine with doing that. You know, hey, what do we have to do? We've just come up with more Zoom stuff. So we're not on any sort of timeline here. But for next time, we'll finish this chapter and then read the next one on given will be our assignment. Any final thoughts or comments about the material tonight or anything for the overall community before we sign off for the evening?
Thank you, Father Bailey.
I appreciate all of y'all sharing what you did. And this chapter is pretty rough. A couple of y'all said that to me. Like, it's a little rough chapter. But I hope you got something out of it. I know I did just listening to all of your comments. And then we'll finish up the Eucharistic prayer sequence, as we call it, next time. And really dive into what it means to be given something by God. And it's a very powerful chapter. All right, my friends. Well, until next time, thank you again. And I look forward to seeing you the next time.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.